is about is really looking to say, how is it that entrepreneurs are part of this picture, and how are they providing solutions that can have a meaningful impact to this crisis on one side, and then the other side is really looking at the refugees themselves and how are they in their own entrepreneurial right contributing to solutions for their populations at the current time, and then looking forward as well. And to do this, we have a really nice panel of folks that come from all over with a bunch of different perspectives. So quick intro, Céline Schmitt is a Senior Public Information Officer at UNHCR. So she can bring a lot of perspective in terms of what's happening on the policy side, and also a lot of field experience currently now in France, but previously also in Africa, in terms of what the reality is for refugees and looking in camps. Clewett, who is the Executive Director of Ashoka as Hello Europe, who is based out of Madrid, and who has a really good view of what's happening in terms of entrepreneurship relating to refugees, whether that be direct services or indirectly helping refugees to become integrated into society. And is also doing some interesting work with policymakers that we'll look at. Omar Itani, who's coming to us from Beirut, and who is the GM of FabricAID, which is a clothing for low-income individuals, so whether that be refugees or otherwise, and who has a really nice perspective also on what's happening in Lebanon, which is a really different perspective, I think, than what we are seeing in Europe for those of us based in Europe. Because 1 in 4 individuals is a refugee in Lebanon, and so this is a really different, let's say, social makeup than what we have here. And Théo Scubla, who is the founder and CEO of Wintegreat and Wero, based out of Paris, and who works on really integrating refugees through job opportunities and educational opportunities into society, so that they can really contribute, and also so society can really gain value from their inputs. And so I think I would like to ask you all to start with a more in-depth introduction of who you are, where you're coming from. Céline, can we start with you, please?
Yes, of course. Thank you very much. And also, I'm very happy to be here today with such a great panel. And I think it's so important to, talk together and share our views from different actors in different sectors. And this is something which is really important for us at UNHCR. The situation worldwide is not good. And we see it again with the COVID today, that there is really a need to work all together to find solutions. We've been working on that for a few years now at UNHCR. And we've used decades of experience to see how can we improve the inclusion of refugees, because this is something key, and how can we improve the work all together, really to embrace the whole of society approach. And that work, the result of that work all together has been the adoption of a global compact on refugees by the UN, by the UN General Assembly. And that global compact is really a roadmap for different actors to work together. The private sector, of course, governments, but also civil society, universities, researchers, and also refugees themselves. And that's also something very important when we talk about working all together, is the participation of refugees. And there as well, UNHCR, we're really focusing on that worldwide, and I can talk more about that later. But also in France, where we have a network of refugee volunteers with whom we're working. And this is even more crucial now to find solutions together, because what we really see, when talking to refugees, is that they're willing to work together with their host communities. They have skills, they have talents. Sometimes they don't have access, to the same network we have, and we really have a role to play there. So yes, I really look forward to the discussion. I can talk about all of that more in details throughout the hour. Thank you again.
Okay, and Kenny, can you please give us a brief introduction?
Yeah. Thank you for having me here. It's great to be on the call with some amazing people. Just a brief picture of what Hello Europe is and how we're looking at this. Hello Europe emerged in 2015 from within Ashoka and other partners, including Zalando, the Robert Bosch Foundation, and others. And it was basically a response to what was poorly called the refugee crisis back in 2015. It wasn't a crisis. It wasn't a problem, but that was the name media used. But what we found at that moment was there was a massive or a large amount of people coming to Europe, and our structures weren't built for that. There's something we were talking about right before the call, right? The way we had thought about refugees and migrants doesn't apply anymore to the current situation, and less now with this situation. So what we did was we identified innovations that were working and that were solving issues from all around the world and brought them to Europe through accelerators. So the first piece of Hello Europe, first thing we do is identify solutions from the social innovation sector and move them across borders. Just like people move across borders, we need solutions to move across borders because we need innovation very quickly. From there, we've grown into an organization that is more and more about changing migration from a divisive issue to a system of solutions and change makers. Kind of to Sabine's point, there's massive amount of change making potential within the migration community, whether they're refugees or economic migrants, and it's something that's overlooked a lot. So that's something that we really spend a lot of time on, and we do that by facing the acceleration challenge. We need to accelerate and scale solutions across borders. Secondly, by connecting policymakers and policy decisions with social innovation. They're two sectors that are often, there's a big gap between them that shouldn't be there. Both of them need each other a lot to come up with creative solutions for new realities. And then thirdly, we work a lot on the narrative around migration. And this is something I think we'll talk about a bit more later. But one thing we discovered as we entered more and more into this conversation was that regardless of the practical changes, if the narrative around migrants is at best placing migrants as passive subjects of pity or compassion, we're not going to go anywhere. What we see and what organizations that function well and that work well see is migrants are change makers, willing to contribute and eager to contribute. How do we lower the barriers for that to happen? And I think that's a huge challenge for the sector, and it's a huge challenge now as again, a lot of decisions are being made about COVID and about borders and about all kinds of stuff, and the people that are most affected by them still aren't in the room most of the time, and that's a problem because it creates bad solutions. It's not even it's a moral problem as well, but it's more just a practical problem. If you don't have the customer in the room designing the solution will necessarily be worse than it could be. So anyway, that's what we do at Hello Europe. We work with around 100 solutions, and just for this context, one thing we did in Europe is we brought together all the solutions right when the pandemic started and said, what are the things you need? What are the problems you're seeing, et cetera? And that's some of what we're trying to bring to the conversation, is not what I see, but what a lot of these solutions and social entrepreneurs and change makers from a migrant background are seeing and needing. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Okay, and let's pass on to our entrepreneurs in the panel. Omar, can you give a brief introduction of you and the work that you're doing?
Sure. First, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here in this panel, and I absolutely agree with what Kenny was saying. Basically, from the basis of, especially about pity, like from the notion of dignifying and looking at refugees as human beings with needs and wants exactly like everybody else, FabricAID started. FabricAID collects secondhand clothes from schools, universities, businesses. We sort them, we clean them, and we sell them at extremely affordable prices to marginalized communities. A big portion of those are refugees. The prices range between maximum 0.3, between 0.3 and maximum $2 per item. And items that cannot be resold at affordable prices are in a bad condition, are recycled into several products, industrial construction material, and we also have like vintage stores. So it's a value chain that deals with the circular economy of secondhand clothing. And the aim is to help underprivileged communities get decent clothing at affordable prices while reducing fabric waste. One of the main points that we focus on at FabricAID is the way the cloth is distributed. So we have stores in the most underprivileged areas in Lebanon. Some of them are in refugee camps. People get into the shops, everything is hanged, neatly displayed. Prices are at extremely affordable prices. There's fitting rooms, personalized advice. People come to the shop, they choose whatever they want at prices that they can afford without feeling that somebody is doing charity for them. They have the power to choose whatever they want. And it's not a charity shop, it's a normal shop registered as a company. And this was the main aim of FabricAID, and that's why we became the biggest clothes retailer, second-hand clothes retailer in the region in a very short period of time, because of giving people the opportunity to choose whatever they want. And now with the pandemic, a lot of things are changing, hopefully to the better. And I'll be more than happy to discuss this throughout the course of the conversation.
Great, thank you. And Théo?
Same for, for me also, the adventure started in 2015 when, in fact, it was the so-called refugee crisis, as you said, Kenny. Of course, it was not the name we wanted to use because we had this realization at that time. In fact, we were just facing the gap between refugees' potential and their current situation, which was far from it. And it was underlying not a burden, but above all an opportunity of value creation for the whole society. And this is what we wanted, in fact, to seize while building Wintegreat. So we created Wintegreat with this mission to breathe new life into refugees' professional projects, and at the same time enable society to seize the opportunity from their integration. And so we created a really simple way to engage the companies in universities, the citizens, whether they are students or professionals or part of the community of the university, are working with us. And we engage them in a global program that is revealing refugees' potential, that is enabling them either to resume their studies or find a job. And whatever the qualifications, of course, and they can be very low qualifications to high qualifications, has no importance, there's still potential. And then through this program, in fact, and that's the main goal we have, we bridge in fact, refugees and the question of refugees with society and the economy, so that it can be sustainable then, and a massive approach to enable society access all those talent and avoid this waste that is the current situation. So I think it's, what is reinforced by the situation right now, and what we will be able to talk about, is the fact that there is an urge to build more sustainable solutions and to get out of this pity as everybody said before, and of just charity to really a question of value creation, a question that is becoming mainstream, integrated to the economy in that way that can be fully addressed and fully addressed as an opportunity of value creation.
Yeah, no, and I think this is a really nice way to start, is also looking at right now on the policy side, because policy does dictate a lot of what opportunities will be for refugee populations in different countries in terms of their ability to really integrate, and whether governments actually acknowledge the fact that populations are there to stay, as opposed to populations that are refugees for a fleeting time because of a temporary crisis. And it's a very different perspective to look at refugees as a new part of a population, or to look at them as an external party that will eventually go home, whether that be true or not true. And so Céline and Kenny, and obviously Omar and Théo, please jump in, is that I wanted to get your insights, as both of you are working more on the policy side of things, what that discussion is looking like today, and where is that gap between what's actually happening in terms of integrating refugees, whether that be through these collaborations with startups and innovators, or other types of integrating them into society, and how this is viewed from the perspective of policymakers, and are they open to this kind of a discussion? Have you seen this change?
Yeah, maybe if I can start. I mentioned in my introduction the Global Compact for Refugees, and I think that's a very good sign, because that compact, that roadmap, was adopted by the majority of the members of the UN, and they all agreed that there is a need of a new approach that is a whole of society approach, working all together, sharing responsibility at the global level, because the majority of refugees are not in Europe or in North Africa. They're in countries neighboring the countries they fled. So there was really an agreement that there is a need to share the responsibility globally, and also to include different partners. After the adoption of the Global Compact on Refugees, we organized the first Global Refugee Forum in December last year. More than 3,000 participants came to Geneva from governments, including heads of states, ministers, but also CEOs of companies, directors of foundations, researchers, representatives of the civil society. They all came together to think about what is the global situation and what are the solutions we can find together. And they've pledged solutions. So government have pledged solutions also for legal pathways for refugees. But if I go back now to the private sector and entrepreneurs, which is our discussion today, there have been more than 100 companies and private sector partners participating to the Global Refugee Forum, and they've made substantial pledges of contribution, financial contributions to improve also access to education. We mentioned it's key, for refugees, for their kids, who some of them are spending, like all their childhood in exile, and they need to have access to education, but also pledges for access to employment. So some, very big companies made pledges to allow refugees to access jobs, to train them, to give like language classes. So that's a very good sign, and we see it again now with the COVID situation worldwide and the response to the COVID situation. Again, private sector partners have stepped up and told us we are willing to support, and willing to support, of course, the inclusion of refugees in health systems, in they need social protection, so it's very important. But also, we should not forget, as I said, many of the refugees also need immediate help now. And just to give you an example of throughout North Africa and in the Middle East, over the past weeks, we've received more than 300 calls of people, and the main request and question is, we've lost our jobs, we've lost our income, we need help, we need financial support. So we have to find different solutions for that, and like immediate assistance and support to humanitarian programs and partners is also something very important.
And a question on this, on the Global Compact, because I think there's oftentimes the view with these policy things, right? They're kind of the pie in the sky, and they're extremely important, right? It's a framework for making something happen, and it's really important that those discussions take place and that people agree in principle, etc. But then there's also the reality of the implementation. And so this was December, right? It's not very long ago. But have you really seen concrete actions happening coming out of these discussions?
There are, so, as you said, it was in December, so it's just a few months away. But already at the forum, companies and different partners, they pledged to put in place programs, and they are implementing those programs. So I was mentioning language classes or access to employment. So this is being put in place, but of course a lot of work has to be done. And now taking into this into consideration, you know, this new situation of COVID, we have to reinforce those partnerships and work together. You know, I can give you like a concrete example of, you know, companies who have now joined our call, you know, for support to respond to the COVID situation. For example, Sony made like, you know, a big contribution to our programs, which is crucial to help refugees, but also at the national level. For example, in France, we're working with a foundation which is called the Human Safety Net. They support refugee entrepreneurs. And they've also announced, you know, like new support now to reply and to respond to the new situation, but also to help those entrepreneurs who can be now in an even more difficult situation. So a lot of work still has to be done, but, you know, I want to be positive because partners are really trying to see what they can do and see how we can work together. And of course, as I said, very important also with refugees to empower them, because some also are volunteers and you know, they're like really willing to support. And I'm sure we're also going to talk about health professionals later on, where we also trying to work with different partners. So yes.
Very good. And Kenny, can you maybe, because you've also been working now with policymakers and trying to bridge this gap between what's happening on entrepreneurial level and what's happening in terms of policy discussions. Mm-hmm. What does that look like on your side?
Yeah, no, it is exciting, and I think, like Céline was saying, there is a bit of optimism on the policy side. On the political side, it's a little more complex, and I've learned in the last few years that those are two different levels that need to be addressed and have intersections. But so a couple things. One, first of all, I completely agree with Céline that the global compacts was a huge thing. A lot of our social entrepreneurs were also involved. I think that there's still a lack of representation from migrants there and refugees that needs to be pushed, but that was definitely one of the big victories at a supra political level. Of course, imposing or making it work is one of the complexities, but it's complex anyway with anything. For Hello Europe, our perspectives or the way we're doing this work, what we kind of discovered was you have these social entrepreneurs, and by the way, when Ashoka speaks of social entrepreneurs, we don't mean social businesses. We mean people that are creating organizations, generally nonprofits, that are solving social problems. So the entrepreneurial quality doesn't necessarily mean businesses. It can mean, but not necessarily. So we have these social entrepreneurs that are working on the front ends and actually seeing things change. And they have ideas that can be scaled to policy or ideas for policy. And then you have these policymakers, especially we work in Europe, as our name says, in Brussels, that are sitting in their offices really trying to write good policy. There's a lot of really, really great, smart policy people that want to do good. And again, separating policy from politics is very important at this phase because it's a different job. Policymakers are sitting in the background, writing policy, trying to get stuff to happen, trying to pressure countries into things. And we realized these two groups hadn't talked to each other. So one thing that was a big revelation for me when I was sitting with a bunch of high level policymakers in Brussels, and I said, yeah, we bring social entrepreneurs. And they said, well, I know a Syrian who started a restaurant. I was like, well, that's wonderful. That's really hard to do, but we're not talking about social entrepreneurs that are starting small businesses. We're talking about people that are creating massive systems change. And like, oh, I don't know those people. So, well, let me introduce you. And that started a number of conversations. It's really helpful, which, by the way, some of that is at the core of the global compacts as well, with fellows such as Jane Liu and others that have been speaking to policymakers saying we can do something together. So one thing that I think is really interesting there is there's a willingness to talk together, but there's a lack of these kind of safe spaces to actually have those conversations. Again, that's what Global Compacts tried to do as well. And so what we've been doing at the European level is creating, I'm going to use this word safe space for lack of another word, but kind of safe, secure, curated spaces where we're convening policymakers, we're convening social entrepreneurs, and sometimes other actors, sometimes businesses and others, in conversation where they can actually co-design stuff together. And I think it's been really interesting for me because there's a big critique to the social entrepreneurship sector kind of headed by Anand Girindaharas, which is brilliant, where he's saying, business is often coming in and saying, we can do what government can't do because government's not useful. That's not our approach with social entrepreneurship. It's kind of the other way around, like government and social entrepreneurs and others, they need to work together because this is very complex. It's very difficult and it requires a lot of collaboration. We often say, complex problems require collaborative solutions. And so that's kind of what we're building together. We do that. We just launched our first policy salon. That's what we call them, where we brought together 7 social entrepreneurs that have written key papers on some of the suggestions and responses and recommendations for this particular situation with COVID. I'll put the link into the YouTube in a second. It's on our website. Because we published those papers, and we had a discussion with 7 high-level policymakers, and no one else was in the room. So to really create that environment of being able to create, and then now we're extending them to have individual talks on some of this stuff, but actually to co-create. And we're seeing a lot of success there and a lot of really interesting things. What I would say is this doesn't mean that the other means for affecting policy are invalid. There needs to be protests. There needs to be requests and letters. There needs to be citizens using their rights to challenge policymakers, but there also needs to be space where we can co-design together and not just sit in as a representation or something like that. So anyway, we're seeing a lot of changes there. We're seeing that by training policymakers to understand social entrepreneurs, by training social entrepreneurs to know how to lobby well, and to do good lobbying, and bringing them together and convening. And I think that's one of the keys where we're seeing just a lot of success, a lot of hunger for change, and we're seeing other organizations do similar things. And I think, again, UNHCR is doing some really good work on kind of switching visions to include refugee work along with integration and other stuff. And I think a lot of us are on board with what's going on. So hopefully that's a little bit of a picture of some of the things. I'll stick that link into the YouTube.
Super. Okay. And Théo, I want to stick with Europe for 1 second, Omar, and then I want to hear what's happening from your perspective, also in Lebanon, because I think it's really it's a different discussion, and you guys have had refugees as a reality for a much longer period of time, and or at least in number, right? Which is okay. So let's start with Théo. Have you seen any of these discussions? I know that you and Céline have already mixed, but from the entrepreneurial perspective of really working with the refugees, how do you see what's happening?
I think that, first, what has been said is really true. I think there is more and more alignment between, at the same time, policymakers, private sectors, and social entrepreneurs on this very question that, in fact, this question of integration is now being seen as an investment, literally, and it should be seen as an investment, because what the crisis shows us and reinforces the fact that first we need all the energies, and second we all depend on each other. And I mean, it sounds obvious, but people realize it now, and they are being more and more aligned on the fact that we need to take this whole issue as an investment for the long term, of course, to address the vulnerability now, but at the same time focus on the long term, finance trainings, invest in the question, and grow the solutions so that we can really integrate them to the economy in the long run. And that's what I think at the same time the companies we are working with are trying to do, to integrate, in fact, the question of integrating refugees' talent in the core business model, not through philanthropy, but really while recruiting people and seeing how they can really value this talent that is here. At the same time, it's the case for policymakers that are now willing to also invest more, enter in new way also to finance the question of refugees through, for example, social impact bonds that are really thinking about how, in fact, costs are avoided through the solutions that are helping refugees at macroeconomic level. So it's, I think there is, I mean, I'm optimistic, and I have to be, because there's no other way. But I think this crisis stresses this fact that it's an investment, and that at least that's what we are trying to do also with Wintegreat, and to build long-term solutions to help people have jobs up to the expectation, and to put this whole question that was before the crisis still managed by some specialists in a corner. But as I say often, talking about integration in a corner is a bit, complicated intellectually. So it has to become mainstream and to be put at the center of society. That's what we try to do with our companies. But that's also, I think, what is the main dynamics that I'm observing from my side.
Super. Okay, and Omar, can you give us some insights? What's happening in Lebanon, right? Because I think that the discussion there is different, but are you seeing policy changes? Are these changes that have already taken place? What does it look like for you?
So it's a very different conversation in Lebanon. Just let me give like a bit of background about what's happening. Lebanon has a population of 4.25 million, and we hosted around. And Lebanon is hosting around 1.5 million Syrian refugees. We also have around 250,000 Palestinian refugees. To put those numbers into perspective, Germany has 80 million, and it's the biggest European host of refugees, Syrian refugees. So out of 80 million, there's 1 million Syrian refugees. In Lebanon, there's 4.25 million, and there's 1.5 million Syrian refugees, which means that per capita, Lebanon took 20 times more refugees than Germany. Saying the situation is even more critical in Jordan, when the percentage per capita is the highest in the world. The biggest issue is that Syria is a big country surrounded by two small countries that took the biggest load of refugees, and this had impacts on, and both of those countries are already facing social, environmental, and political problems. So it is a tough situation. And another thing that is very important to take into perspective is that Lebanon has already around 250,000 Palestinian refugees that have been refugees for 60 years. So the refugee crisis in Lebanon with Palestinians started in 1948. It became bigger and bigger in 1967. But we have refugee camps that are 60 years old. One of the refugee camps in Burj Brajni, a camp that we work a lot in, has 35,000 refugees. It's a small camp, but it's 1 square kilometer. So you can imagine the condensation of refugees. Another issue that it's worth noting is that in the past 6 months, let's say, Lebanon had the biggest fires in the history of the country, a revolution where the government was replaced with another government, and then a severe devaluation and a halting of the economy and a severe devaluation of the currency, and then the Covid-19 situation. So I totally understand the idea of working with policymakers and with the government, but this is a luxury that I don't think we have in Lebanon. It's not in the priorities of the government, unfortunately, of course, to work with refugees, because there's so many other problems that they are trying to solve, and they are not good at it. They are there's a huge issue of corruption and incompetence. So the idea of waiting for them and trying to lobby, they don't have the capacities, they don't have the. It's not the way to solve the problem. We figured out this back in 2010. So in lab, yes, if you can work with policymakers and have collaborations between government, social enterprises, NGOs, and businesses, that's definitely the way to do it. But in several places around the world, we don't have this luxury, and that's why that's how the situation in Lebanon is different. I can tell you more about what is being done currently on the ground if we have time.
Yeah, no, I think it would be nice to explore also, because when we had talked, there was also a lot of people stepping up to the plate to fill in that gap, right? And And I think there's a big difference. I mean, I'm American. I also see that a lot from the perspective. I think there's a very different perspective in Europe, where there is an expectation for government to play an important role in the provision of basic services, and countries where that's not necessarily the case. And that in some ways this really leads to a lot of cohesion among society. It also leaves room for a lot of people to work on an entrepreneurial level, to contribute, etc. And so it would be really interesting to understand, how are you seeing society step up? How are you seeing companies step up, individuals step up to kind of fill in that gap and help? And are refugees part of that? Are they actually coming up with some of those solutions themselves?
Yes. So apologies for starting with a very gloomy description of reality, but now I'm going to the positive sides that I'm way more excited to talk about. Let me just talk about the last 2 months and a half with the corona situation. The biggest fear, COVID-19, the biggest fear was for the virus to spread in those refugee settlements and refugee camps, especially noting that you can't say to refugees to stay in your houses. There's tens and tens, like some houses have more than 20 people. So that's not a solution. But what we saw was amazing, that most refugee camps in Lebanon, the virus didn't spread in any of the refugee camps, not because of the refugee, not because of the government, not because of a policy, not because of social enterprises, because of the refugees themselves. They did border across the most refugee camps. There's a checkpoint on the entrance of the refugee camp. Everybody should wear gloves. Everybody should have a face mask. They spray people. They turned fridges into isolation rooms where you are sprayed when you enter the refugee camps. I think one of the safest spots to be in the situation is in a refugee camp, because of the advanced precaution levels and just how much people are abided by the rules they set on themselves. So there was a huge degree of self-governance that blew our minds. Ventilators were being produced inside refugee camps, face masks. So things were very positive, and it's very nice to see how when people collaborate together, any community, they can really protect themselves and alleviate their lives. In the same time, because of the situation, because of the how severe the problem is, and that you cannot rely on the government for the time being, we received record clothes donations. Since the start of Corona, we never collected this much clothes. Not only that, we never collected. We don't do food. We focus only on clothing. But because of the insane amount of people who wanted to donate food and they wanted to donate money and wanted to help each other within those situations, because at a certain point, with the start of COVID-19, you can, of course, the help of UN agencies and several other countries is instrumental and very important, but it, of course, decreased drastically because the situation was very sudden, and all those countries and agencies have problems domestically that they were dealing with. So it gave an atmosphere that you need to take care of your own selves, and that's why you saw a huge amount of people who wanted to donate clothes, who wanted to donate money. For the past 2 months, our trucks were working on distributing more food than clothes. Food that we didn't donate. Just people were from privileged areas. They were sending it to underprivileged neighborhoods. More importantly, social enterprises have been expanding, working more and more. Coalition of social enterprises has been a very successful model in Lebanon. One model definitely worth mentioning. It's called some sort of a social incubator and investor called Al Fanar, and they have a big number of social enterprises employing thousands of benefiting thousands of refugees. Through this incubator, the technical support was divided, the financial support was divided. They have a fundraising going on right now, but all this money is being channeled to social enterprises, and the government and the governance and the policy is basically more of the decision of the coalitions between social enterprises more than of it being from the government.
Mm. Please go ahead.
At one point, exactly as Omar said, yeah, we can't wait for policies right now, and we see that also in France. In this crisis fosters collaboration between different social companies that are addressing right now the vulnerability people are suffering from, and trying to still keep the links with people to fight against isolation. Isolation, etc. And then loneliness, but at the same time, it leaves and opens a door for for, of course, more collaboration, but for more sustainable collaborations between different businesses, social entrepreneurs, etc. That gives, in fact, a real way for new solutions, and this shows, in fact, where it goes. Policies then are following, but first, these collaborations of social entrepreneurs above all that are also happening in France at the same time help us and help everybody tackle the short-term issues and build the long-run issues also, and solutions, so that we can address the world questions.
Yeah, and I wanted to go back to Omar. You were saying that there was some of the refugees themselves putting in place protections, but also the building of ventilators, the masks, etc., which is really impressive. Is that are we seeing opportunities in Europe, or are we seeing, well, opportunities? I don't know. Are we seeing actually refugees that are stepping up and doing this kind of thing in Europe, or contributing in some way to actually managing this crisis, right? I think, Céline, we had touched on a lot of refugees that are medically trained, for example, and that if you don't tap into those folks, that they don't necessarily have a role to play, but if you do, that you have the Syrian population in particular, I think, is a very well-educated population with a lot of skills that can be contributed. And so how are we seeing that happen in Europe? And with Céline and Théo, I would love to get your insights on this as well.
Yes, my reply to your question is very short, is yes. We've seen a lot of support from refugees themselves, and we have a network of refugee volunteers who are living in different cities in France, and we've been working with them as well, to make sure that the right information about COVID is being shared with all, and including with the most vulnerable communities, which also means that you have to have prevention documents and leaflets and translated into different languages. But also, we've seen how to work with refugees to support them and to maintain, contacts during this difficult time where we are all, at home, and it can be, even more difficult now for people who have, already suffered from trauma, escaped war, and so these are, things we're working on. But then what we've seen as well is a lot of offers to support from refugees and health workers, but also in other areas, like refugees who have restaurants and are now cooking free meals for hospital staff because they think this is what they can do, and they really want to support the response, fight together against COVID. We've had many nurses and doctors calling us saying, we want to register on the emergency roster. We want to go and help in hospitals. We know what it is. We also know what it is to be in a stressful situation because we've lived in conflict areas. So we want to support now our host communities. So we're working with the authorities, but also with the Council of Europe, to try and find ways to recognize the talents, the competencies of the qualifications of the refugees, and help the authorities to identify those health professionals who can help in responding to the COVID, to make sure they can be included and they can help. We've also had calls and messages of entrepreneurs telling us we want to help producing face masks for example, and you know, with the idea as well to support women who are in vulnerable situations. So there have been, you know, really great ideas and support, and on our side as well, UNHCR, with one of the initiatives, you know, we created, which is called Made 51, which is a brand of art craft crafted by refugees worldwide. We've there as well, you know, we've tried to see how can we now use that opportunity. There is a need for face masks, you know, and that need is just not now, but it's for the longer term. Again, you know, like to really use that creativity and talents of refugees and work all together. So there are initiatives. There is a big will to support, and now, and as Théo said, you know, we have to see that now, but also for the longer term. And what we're trying to build now, and maybe to deblock some situations, to allow refugees to work, to allow refugees to contribute to the health response as well, you know, is going to build the future. So the work that is being done now is very important, and this is, you know, the reason why, again, you know, we have to work together on that.
There is a very concrete point we saw about that, Céline, is the fact that, I mean, from our perspective and WIRO's perspective, WIRO is the recruitment agency we built for the recruitment of refugees. We saw that, in fact, during the crisis, all the persons that, in fact, were medically trained, doctors, etc., who are in normal times unable to exercise to do what they can do because they are restricted policies and restricted laws that in fact is not making possible for them to be doctors in France because just they don't have all the equivalencies, etc. All this administrative background disappeared during the crisis, or at least was alleviated. So what was interesting is that all those doctors who were not able to work in France normally now could. And it's open, in fact, at the same time, a door to alleviate the restrictions on those professions, at the same time, to show that refugees are just able to answer concrete needs of the economy, concrete and current needs, and they are not just people we need to integrate on top, etc. They address concrete needs. So it just also fosters the idea that we need solutions that are just connected to the needs of the economy, and refugees are part of the solution. That's all.
And part of the economy. I want to pull in one last question that we have from the audience that for Théo and Kenny, that's looking at upskills, education levels, and the question is the quality of the training that is being provided to refugees to help them to access employment. And so, Théo, I think you can answer directly to this. And Kenny, I would love to also get your insights. So if there's other groups that you know of that are doing this, how they're contributing and what we see in general in terms of the ability of refugees to get educated and then be able to use that education to access employment in their host country.
Sure. So about I mean, trainings, education, etc. I mean, the system we built is I mean, on the one hand, addresses, I mean, the main needs refugees have to be employable. Can be a language barrier, soft skills, so that they can integrate all the, I mean, the codes to then evolve in the workplace. Can be social connections, network. Can be credibility, and I mean the global also professional projects the person have. So we accompany people on all those questions, so that then they have all the tools to I mean be updated. I mean and able to to do what they can do and what they already know to do, and because they have experiences, they have competencies in another environment, that is the host society. But this is not, in fact, the only thing that is working, because what we saw also is the fact that even if we are super well trained, adapted person that are really and ready to work, it's not, it won't work, automatically, because we need at the same time to lift barriers on company side and on society side that are working also with refugees. For example, companies, even if we send them someone that is ready to work, won't automatically recruit the person because they are not able to see and to identify the talents. So at the same time, and next to all the trainings we do that are addressing the particular barriers, at the same time helping people to boost their qualifications, we need at the same time to educate companies and society to identify those very talents and those very competencies that are in fact perceived as atypical in an environment that is different, so that then we can also create the connection between the two and help companies also see the value behind those competencies, because they don't see it immediately. They see it in theory, but as soon as we are coming to practice, we don't see that anymore. So we need really to think about education and qualifications, not only on refugees in a binary way, refugees versus the economy, but really in a complex way where we have to, in fact, to educate everybody, the society, the citizens, the companies, and of course refugees, so that they can mutually adapt and see their mutual value they can bring. That's at least what we try to do at Wintegreat.
Yeah, just to build on that, I think you said something really important. It's one of the reasons I don't like the word integration, or we should use it both ways. Like who's integrating where? Because and so there are other organizations working on this, like Upwardly Global. Chiron is doing some interesting work on a lot of this, and Be Social in Germany. Like there's other organizations, and actually, like on our website, there's a section around there. But perhaps just to add something to this, what I discover more and more is because of what you were saying, because it's so hard for companies and for others to adapt. It's so hard for large nonprofit organizations to actually hire and value migrant leadership, starting with Ashoka. It's been almost impossible to quickly hire leadership. We have to change all our structures and a lot of stuff. One of the things I'm turning to more and more in Hello Europe is how do we help migrants and or people from a migrant background, because it's often children and their children's children, create organizations and create companies and create their own initiatives, so that they're not working against the system that's built against them, and B, so that they actually are bringing new skills. Because if we have to train refugees to desocialize from what they've been socialized to re-socialize to a structure that's individualistic, that's consumeristic, that hasn't worked for us, we're losing out on some of the major potential that they're bringing to the table, particularly in the social sector. We keep finding there's these amazing social entrepreneurs leading in their communities, but they're not part of the mainstream system. They're not being invited to the ChangeNOW talks or to the Ashoka talks or to and this isn't a pointed criticism. It's kind of for the whole sector. They're not in the sector, but we need them desperately. So how do we get there? Well, maybe it's supporting them to build their own organizations to build some of this stuff. So anyway, that's a piece that I think contributes a lot to narrative as well. And it's something we're working on in Hello Europe, which is mapping out where are the leaders and the change leaders and change makers from migrant background, and what are some of the needs they have to improve their ventures, but also for some of them to also contribute a lot more to these other conversations and be part of these conversations. What we found at Ashoka, and Ashoka's maybe one of the best organizations in the world at finding leaders, we're not finding them, which means there's something wrong with us. So we need to change our systems and go deeper into some of these communities and change the way we ask questions. Just like we did years ago, we were finding all these male social entrepreneurs and very few women. It wasn't because there were fewer women social entrepreneurs, because we were asking the wrong questions. So how do we adapt our questions as well, and the way we look for people to actually include a lot of these leaders in the conversation? Not, again, it's not out of a moral or ethical desire, although that should be part of it. It's out of efficiency and efficacy. Our solutions are not working. What we're coming up with, it generally doesn't meet where people are. And we're not able to integrate these leaders into our organizations. So let's help them create their organizations so that we're seeing them eye to eye. So that's something we're working on really hard this year with a pilot in Spain and also around Europe, is identifying these change leaders, bringing them together and asking them, how can we help? Why don't you build something, co-creating it, not coming across and creating an initiative. And I think stuff like that is going to make the big difference, and very much related to business sector and the other sectors.
Great. You all, I'm very sorry. I need to wrap up because I've just seen that we are close to an hour. And that's our allotted slot for doing this talk. And so I want to thank you all very, very much. It's been really interesting having this discussion. I have a bazillion other questions and things that I would love to talk about. So we'll have to continue this at a later date, maybe at ChangeNOW next year, to really see how things have developed, because it's been really nice to hear some of the really positive things that are coming out, but obviously there's still a huge amount of work to do. And so I'm glad that we're all feeling overall positive, but also that you all continue to do amazing work to really contribute to making refugees really a part of the societies that they're based on, and that despite the negative impacts of COVID, that there are really some positive impacts that are coming out in the way that folks have had to react to this kind of immediate crisis, and that hopefully those impacts are really things that last beyond this crisis and really have a longer term impact in the way that refugees and their host societies are communicating and working and living together. So thank you all very, very much for joining us. And thank you everyone at home listening for joining us. I hope that this was useful and enjoyable on your front, and everyone have a great afternoon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.